Lovely. Thanks so much, Michelle, and thanks to all the team, Kirsty and Ellie at MathObs for having me today. It's really great to join you. So I'll just share my screen if that's okay. So while I'm doing that, I'll say that, yeah, I've worked on histories of alcohol for a long time, and currently writing a book about London Irish pubs in roughly this period, actually, but going into the sort of end of the 20th century. But I'm very much a historian of the 20th century. So hopefully, there we go. Can everybody see the slides? Is that okay? Okay, Michelle. Great, lovely, thank you. So, thinking about women's drinking in the period from the 50s to the 70s, and I just wanted to start out by saying that I've worked with mass observation records for a long time now. Feel the kind of ghost of Tom Harrison sitting on my shoulder as I talk about something that was a really big part of mass observation. I did it, as I'm sure many people know, an awful lot of work on pubs. But I also, in recent years, have come to work with the Archive of Market and Social Research that Phyllis will be talking about a bit later. And I think just wanted to mention that one of the really interesting things for me has been how those two archives have worked together and the way that can get material from AMSR that molds really nicely, but also tells a slightly different story from the mass observation records. So they at least make me one happy historian. And I'm going to be mentioning today things also drawn from the Guinness Archive in Dublin and also some magazines and newspapers and so on. So it's, but principally thinking about mass observation and AMSR. So I'm going to really talk about three. First of all, just touch on the kind of commonplace attitudes towards women's drinking. We can see very much echoes of those today, but certainly in the period of the post-war years, they're very dominant attitudes. I'm going to talk about women in pubs, groups of women, why are women going to pubs, what reasons, and what was the reaction to them. And then finally, I'm going to be talking about what women were drinking when they went to the pub. So without further ado, thinking about attitudes towards women's alcohol consumption. What can we learn? Why bother? What's the point of all of this? What can we learn from the history of women's drinking? Well, in broad terms, alcohol consumption can very much be seen as a barometer of broader social societal change. We can think, as we're doing today, about gender. We can also think about social class, race, sexuality, age, generation, lots of different factors. And the way in which drinking both reflects, but actually also shapes broader changes, and we can trace those developments as we go along, and hopefully through my talk today we can kind of discern some of those developments. So what were the dominant attitudes? And certainly I think we can see the ways in which there's been change over time, but still resonances today. There still is a legacy around the idea that women's alcohol consumption is less acceptable than men's. And certainly this was the case for much of the 20th century. A lot of mass observations work reflects this, the idea that women's drinking is more problematic. And certainly that's very much the case in terms of what we might term problem drinking or addiction, alcoholism. There are different terms in use and they change over time. But the notion that for a woman to be, to use the label alcoholic, that was more problematic than it was for a man, however difficult might be in terms of masculinity, in terms of the inebriated woman, that was even more contentious. And we can see this headline from the Daily Mail from 1979, women tipplers put life at risk. The idea that there's more at stake for women. And linked to this is a very deeply entrenched idea that women's drinking, and most especially women's drunkenness, was perceived as unladylike, that it was cutting across a swathe of traditional gender norms about propriety, social conduct, femininity, the idea that drinking, and especially drunkenness, really pushed back against that. This is an image from the well-known photojournalism magazine Picture Post from 1954, depicting what it claims is a cat fight, quote unquote, from a pub in the East End, two women fighting, having been drinking, they're fighting over a mat. So there's this um, sense of this image, I'm quite sure a staged image, but that sense of the unladylike as being important in all of this. And one of the other major themes that we see is women's drinking being framed in relation to gender and sexuality. And that can cut both ways. There is a fairly dominant narrative around drinking and going to public houses as something that could make women vulnerable. Now, all of this is very much predicated overwhelmingly in terms of men and women, heteronormativity, dominant kind of gender relations at this point. So we can see on the left there the quotation from Cosmopolitan magazine. We still feel like intruders paying for the privilege of being leered at by members of the Boys' Night Out Brigade. So this idea that if you were drinking, that this might put you in a kind of sphere of, the unwanted attention of the public house, and that by being in the public house, you were opening yourself up to this. So there's that angle. Perhaps less common, but it's also there, and it's again a long-running trope that's been there, is the idea that a woman who has consumed alcohol, and particularly a woman who is inebriated, could somehow be kind of sexually promiscuous. So there's this quotation that comes from the Daily Mail, this idea that women have found that alcohol is the drink of love, as it phrases it. They believe that drinking increases their sexual drive. So there's this notion that alcohol both aids and abets problematic behaviour among women. So these are some of the kind of the deeply entrenched tropes that are shaping discussion of women's drinking. They do traverse longer time periods than the post-war to the 70s, but certainly they're dominant at this point as well. But I think it's also really important to emphasise the idea that there's lots of discussion about women's drinking as being linked to community. And certainly this is something that mass observation really emphasised. This photo here of a Sheffield pub in 1961, this idea particularly of working class community coming together in a space, a sort of egalitarian space of the public house. Community. You can also see this here in this image of Liverpool, the local pub, 1974. By this point, some of the ideas, the discourses around working class community, we have this idea of community is fragmenting and the pub almost being an emblem of the best that we've lost. This idea that the pub could be a space where everyone would just pop round the corner, go to their local, and with the kind of shifting housing patterns of the later 20th century, that community was being lost, and the local as an institution, that was losing its importance. So there's a number of different kind of things in circulation here. So women in pubs, who's going, why they're going, what are they doing? Well, I'm sure lots of people here today will know Mass Observations, later work in the 20th century. Its volume from 1961, Britain Revisited, takes a look again at a lot of the work that they've been doing in the 30s. And their point that they made about pubs and women's drinking was women, they come in much more than they used to. That was their observation in 61. What does this mean, much more than they used to? Essentially, it's a kind of look back at pub cultures from earlier in the century, and in particular mass observations work in this field. And there is a really dominant idea of the pub as a man's space, a masculine republic, as some scholars have noted about mass observations work in the late 1930s. This idea that there's cultures of masculinity, there's sociability, there's a camaraderie. And certainly there's lots of evidence of this from a whole variety of sources, including photographic sources. This idea that there's a sort of a relaxation, a kind of camaraderie, a conviviality that comes in the pub, and that as a male space that's much vaunted and much valued by many men. Primarily, that's phrased in terms of working class culture, but increasingly more diverse as well. A lot of the commentary on pub cultures from earlier in the century, yes, we see this kind of continuity, the male space. A lot of it is absolutely implicitly framed in terms of whiteness. And I think it's really useful to note that um, although there still needs to be much more work done by historians, there is plenty of evidence of a kind of diverse race profile, different communities very much reflecting the people that live there. So this is a Birmingham pub from 1964, local black residents going, and that was absolutely a really important part of that community life. So although lots of the commentary might explicitly, probably implicitly mean that pub customers were white, actually there's something much broader going on. I'll come back to questions of race a bit later. But principally this idea of the pub as a man's space. And that came across hugely very much the case in Mass Observation's own work on Bolton, or Worktown, as they named it. In the late 1930s, the Lancashire town of Bolton. I have here some of the images by Humphrey Spender, this idea of the pub as a man's space, standing to drink, perpendicular drinking as they called it, standing to drink in the vault, games, plays dominoes, cards, that this was really central to the idea of a man's recreation at this point. My students know I'm fairly obsessed with some of these photographs. And this is another Spender image. This is women. So for all the talk of Mass Observation's discussion of the pub in Bolton as a man's space, there's plenty of evidence that they acquire, that they develop, that shows the presence of women. And some of their surveys note that up to a third of pub customers could be women. So we have this image from Humphrey Spender, a lounge area, women we can see with their hats, one with a fur collar, the very image of propriety and respectability. We can see them there. So women are in the pub, even though there is this discussion of the pub as a male space, women are absolutely there. They're absolutely there. But they're going in more often. More women are going in more of the time. That's what's happening in the post-Second World War period. And that's certainly something that Mass Observation notes themselves in their survey of 61. They essentially go back to Worktown and they go and do further pub crawls. And there's literally comparisons in this volume of, we go back to that pub and we look and see what's changed. There's interesting stories of continuity, but the question of how women's drinking is changing is certainly something that really comes through very clearly. They say, for instance, there were several groups, twos and threes, of young women drinking together without men. And this is certainly receiving, far less comment than it might have done had it ever happened back in the 30s. And there's also a really interesting comment about the odd woman drinking standing at the bar, something that was never seen in the post-war years. Standing to drink for Mass Observation, at least, was very much emblematic of a masculine drinking culture. It was about strength, virility, masculinity, the idea that someone might be working for a long shift in a factory and then come and stand in the pub, in the vault, for the evening. So the idea was that women sat to drink. They sat in the lounge in a kind of respectable setting. So the notion that Mass Observation at this point is saying, look, women are standing to drink. It's not just about how the space is used. It's about gendered behaviour and how femininity is being expressed and understood. So there's lots of evidence of how going to the pub for women was linked to being part of a couple, very much framed in terms of men and women, heteronormativity. We can see that with courting couples. There's an image from 54 in London, and also married couples. And we've got an image here from the Gorbals in Glasgow, a poverty-stricken area. But this idea of perhaps saving a few pennies, going to the pub, as remaining a really important ritual in working class life. That idea of time together was celebrated and noted. But we also see changes. I think This image tells an interesting story. It's from the well-known photographer Bert Hardy for Picture Post magazine, and it's in Bromley in Kent. The couple, they're married, she has a ring on, but they're both standing at the bar, both with their foot on the bar rail, which is a very, very different kind of perspective of women. We do see a woman standing with her husband in the background, but the idea that women could stand at the bar and drink, and that would be really fit very closely with this image of a kind of a respectable, fashionable, socially mobile culture, that the pub was part of all of that. It wasn't just a kind of fading institution of the 1920s and 30s. This idea that the pub was a place where one would wish to be seen as a woman. I touched on race earlier on. There are not very many, but there are images of couples together, mixed race couples indeed. This is an image from Birmingham, black woman and a white man dancing together in 1967. So a kind of pub event, the idea of band playing, there might be dancing, the idea that a pub was a very important site of sociability for all sorts of different communities and for all sorts of different reasons. Now, it's also worth noting that although the kind of heteronormativity, the sort of mainstream understanding of romantic and sexual relationships was really framed in terms of the male drinker, female drinker, husband, wife, courting couple. That's really clear. But what we're also seeing at this point is they're pretty sparse, but they are there. References to lesbian cultures, lesbian and queer women going to pubs. This is very much a phenomenon, won't be surprising to any of you, but very much a phenomenon of urban Britain, principally London in many ways, although some other cities as well. So this is a survey of swinging London from 1966. It has a chapter on lesbian London, and it says two of the most popular pubs where there's often a good sprinkling of the girls are one in Battersea, a mainly working class pub, and one in Notting Hill, which caters for the more sophisticated. So there is this idea that if one knew where to go, there would be spaces where lesbian kind of communities were growing up, and that was part of the pub as well. It is certainly the case, it's important to note, it was more dominant in private members' clubs. Few and far between, but they are there. The most famous is the Gateways in Chelsea, in London. This was an important lesbian and queer women's club from this period. But I wanted to draw out the point that there is some commentary about public houses as well. We touched slightly earlier on the idea of groups of women going together. Certainly what we do see throughout this period consistently is the idea of intergenerational groups. It might be neighbours, but very often it's families. 2, 3, perhaps 4 generations of women going together and drinking. This image from Southampton in the 60s showing precisely this, the idea of women being together in the pub. What we're also starting to see at this time is a greater differentiation in terms of the profile of pubgoers. And I think for me, one of the extraordinary developments is how again, not commonplace at all, but the fact that it's happening merits comment, I think. We have the Chelsea set, as they're known. Literally, the very well-heeled, sometimes aristocrats, debutantes, who become part of what's known as the Chelsea set. So women whose mothers never would have dreamt of going to a public house now are perhaps going, as young women in their late teens, 20s, early 30s, going to pubs in Chelsea. It's particular places, particular pubs, but just the fact that we have this aristocratic presence really speaks to some of the shifting social kind of social networks that there are at this time. You can see on the right there a picture post image of American actress Dorothy Lamour. She's whisked off to Chelsea for a pint, no less. Again, showing the changing cultures. This image is reproduced reasonably often. You find it sometimes on blogs. Instagram as evidence of kind of swinging 60s, swinging London. It's a pub called Chelsea Potter. It's an image taken by a photographer called David Hearn. It's 67, and it really shows the way in which some of these pubs in London were becoming seen as much more progressive, that there were spaces for women to drink together, and there would be places where all the kind of trends and fashions of the day would be really obvious. So that's the Chelsea Potter. It's also the case there can be diverse reasons for going to the pub. We've talked about some of the really much more common mainstream ways of couples going together, maybe on Friday or Saturday nights. This is a much, much rarer image. It's from Southall in West London, a pub called the Northcote Arms. And this is a Punjabi writers group, men and women going to the pub together, often what's being written, looking at kind of autobiographical reflections, perhaps on the journey, the whole experience of partition, coming to Britain and migrating to Britain, trying to find out much more about this group and why they choose to go to the pub. So a real upending of some of our expectations there. But the fact that it's taking place shows us that experiences of the pub are shifting. Questions of feminism raise their head. The whole question of women's right to go to the pub, that's something that really plays out, quite a well-known case of El Vino, a wine bar typically framed as a pub on the Strand in London. And there's an important court case, well, several court cases that grow up about El Vino in the 70s and 80s. Essentially, there's a group of women journalists that wish to really pursue their right to stand at the bar and drink. What happened at El Vino? It was full of journalists, full of kind of, the key journalists of the day, Fleet Street writers. Lots of lawyers would come down from the courts further up the Strand. It was a really important place to find out news, to get leads, and so on. Women weren't permitted to stand at the bar. They had to sit down and be served. And a number of women actually took El Vino's managers, owners, to court under the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act, basically to pursue their right to stand at the bar. Part of the justification, the argument that they laid out, was that they were being materially deprived in professional terms of access to knowledge. There's a whole series of court cases. Eventually, the women do win 1982. But El Vino is quite a well-known case, but it certainly shows shifting expectations around how women were treated in pubs, treated by publicans, by management. We start to see shifts. But it's also important to note that these changes were happening across the country. There's a number of pubs that actually come up against the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act, one of them being one of the longest established pubs in Liverpool, the ye old Hole in the Wall. And they, basically 1975 sex discrimination law, and there's a whole series of commentary in the local press about women invading, quote unquote, this particular pub and these bars, and lots of celebratory photographs in the local press. So, diverse reasons for women being in the pub, going to the pub. I'm not at all suggesting that all of the different trends I've mentioned so far, that they're really widespread. Sometimes they're fairly small scale, but they're growing in importance, and we can see their development later on in the 80s and the 90s. But the very fact that the beginnings are happening earlier, sometimes even in the 50s, shows us that the whole kind of reputation of the pub, what's perceived as its purpose, is really much richer and more complex than perhaps has been imagined. I just want to draw things together, thinking about what women were actually drinking. Mass Observation notes in its 1961 survey, the girls drink fancy drinks, gin and orange, rum and orange, and cherry bee and baby sham. So for the uninitiated, the whole kind of question of mixing drinks, simple, what might have been termed cocktails. They were very much seen as the kind of drinks that would be a more special drink. Perhaps if your husband or boyfriend took you to the pub, that you would have one of these at the weekend. It was a kind of a sociable drink. Cherry B and Baby Sham are really interesting developments. They very much speak to the post-war period, the 50s onwards. So we can see there's a mat, beer mat, Cherry B mat on the right-hand side, and also a press ad on the left there. The idea of Cherry B, it's basically a cherry wine. And as I'm sure many people know, Baby Sham, it's a sparkling perry. So if cider is made from apples, then perry is made from pears. And Baby Sham becomes a big deal. So this is Baby Sham advertising report from the AMSR archive. And it really talks in really interesting detail about developing the image of Baby Sham and the brand. It says the more underlying appeals of Baby Sham are the sorts of areas which women are looking for in an alcoholic drink: confidence, sophistication, and romance. So this notion of Baby Sham as something to be seen drinking in the pub, that it would be this kind of appealing sweet drink. There's a lot of discussion about women preferring sweet drinks, and a lot of the market research at this time, and Baby Sham very much fits into that category. Couple of ads from the mid-70s. On the left there, Christmas. There's lots and lots of discussion of kind of having drinks at Christmas. It was a special time, a Christmas treat, and that's a long, long running discourse. But it's here in the 70s. So there she is with her Baby Sham and the Christmas tree. And then that idea of a sort of romanticized image on the right-hand side there. So Baby Sham really tapping into idea social aspiration. This wasn't just the kind of an older drink that had been grown up, with mothers and grandmothers. This was something new for younger generations. And talking of generational change, we can't not talk about Guinness in all of this. There's some really interesting developments. And this is, for me, it's been a very interesting example of how working with different archives can lead you to a story that you wouldn't get from any single one of them by themselves. So there's a discussion, certainly by the 1970s, of who's drinking Guinness and why. And there's a preoccupation, fears among the company, Guinness firm itself, that Guinness has essentially got a reputation as a drink for grannies. This is an advertising report from the firm J.W. Thompson, who were advertising for Guinness in the 70s. They talk about the Guinness drinker and say, stereotypically, she is a lonely little old lady with her string bag of returnables who regularly takes her bottle Guinness for the good of her health. That's the image that they think people have in their heads of who the Guinness drinker is. It's, of course, predicated on one of the most successful advertising logos of all time. The slogan Guinness is good for you, emerging in the 30s, and it still really resonates in the popular consciousness. But Guinness want to do something about all of this. It's a slightly longer quote, but I think it's worth spending a bit of time on these words. It says a strategy since 1971 has been of trying to establish Guinness in the sector of the market, represented by younger, more upmarket, more sociable women drinkers whose motivations are enjoyment rather than medicinal. Guinness has been projected as an elegant, modern drink. The women's advertising is concentrated on projecting the social acceptability, sophistication, and pleasure of being a Guinness drinker. It abandoned the medicinal, restorative motivations in order to challenge fundamentally the negatives around the brand. So, if Granny was constructed, perceived, represented as a negative, what was replacing her? Well, we have these really interesting ads in the mid-70s. We might very much say that they are construed in terms of a male gaze. There's really interesting representations of the woman drinker. I have this: nice girls don't drink Guinness. So this idea that's very much Guinness isn't safe. Guinness isn't just for the kind of the girl next door, the nice girl. But you might still go to the pub, but being in the pub and drinking Guinness says something more interesting, more exciting, more sexually alluring. All of those things. It says something about you. It's not a safe option. which is really interesting. And the messaging in this one, even more overt with her red hair and red lipstick and red nails. You two can turn a few heads in the pub tonight. All you have to do is walk up to the bar and say, in the clearest voice you can muster, a bottle of Guinness, please. So that idea of really um, pushing forwards and rebranding Guinness, absolutely for the woman drinker, but the young, sophisticated, modern consumer, very much not the granny she was. So I hope that gives some insights to some of my thinking, at least about women's drinking in this period. And I'll be really interested to hear your comments and questions. Thank you.